is, this is a young man who had been injured in a bomb. And we're doing a resuscitation on him, trying to determine if he can survive enough to make it to the operating room. This is a nursing student. This is a first-year orthopedic resident. This is the chief of surgery, Dr. Nahid. This is me, and this is another volunteer from the United States. If you look here, there's somebody who's holding the bamboo bag that's giving breast to the patient. That's his brother, who we had to use in that moment to keep delivering breast. Yeah, I mean, this is the miserable situation that you're in. Here we have somebody who is, you can't really see, but one of the nurses holding the blood up to transfuse the blood, squeezing the bag of blood. And when his arms got tired, we'd have the patient's cousin grab it, squeeze the blood to bring it in. We didn't have pumps that we would be able to transfuse the blood. So while we were there, this was a post by the Embassy of Israel in the United States. It was the same post that the Israeli military posted online, saying that this complex where we were at, a massive medical complex, here's the hospital, here's the dialysis building, here's the administrative building, here's the compound here. There was a claim that a rocket had been fired from this compound, and it was followed by an evacuation order on the hospital. Ultimately, what happened to Nasser Hospital is exactly what happened to Shifa Hospital, Al-Mahmadani Hospital, Bauda Hospital, the Indonesian Hospital, Kamal Adwan Hospital, and 4 or 5 other hospitals. The war came to the hospital. The military came to the hospital. They surrounded it. They would lay siege. They cut off the electricity. Then they would raid the hospital. And in this picture that you see here, you have the director of the hospital, Dr. Hu. And this is him interfacing with the Israeli military as they're going floor by floor, room by room. And huh?
Is that Adi Khayadari?
The active soldier? No, I don't think so. Yeah. But this is, this was becoming a pattern of behavior that we noticed, where essentially these hospitals come under evacuation order, and then you're scrambling because you have patients there, and you're trying to figure out where can you transfer these patients. At Shifa Hospital, there were 38 babies in the newborn nursery, and in the NICU, some of them in incubators. When the electricity went out at Shifa, 8 of them died. And so you are struggling trying to figure out, can you deconflict an ambulance to come pick these people up and then take them to a facility that can accommodate them or that can treat them. With those children at Shifa Hospital, 38 children, 22 made it to Rafah, which is the southernmost part where the border is between Egypt. And 20 of them had to be transferred out of Gaza into Egypt because there was no place for them to be able to get treatment. Why? Because hospitals like Shifa, the largest, and Nasser, the second largest, were out of commission. And so those children, there was a story in the Washington Post about them. 20 of them made it to Egypt. 18 of them, parents are not with them. Parents are presumed dead. So 18 children born in Gaza are now in Egypt, being taken care of by good Samaritans in Egypt, have their future sort of in limbo here. We don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't even have travel documents or papers, or they don't have Palestinian passports or ID cards. And so, just because a hospital comes under evacuation order and you can get some of the patients out, it doesn't make it an easy situation where healthcare workers can do their job and figure out how they can accommodate these patients. You don't save lives, because of evacuation orders. In fact, at Nasser Hospital, when the power went out, we had 8 patients in the ICU, 4 of whom suffocated to death because they were on ventilators and the power went out. So this is, that's kind of the situation that you're dealt with. And this is a place where I was at, and amongst other international workers, we never, I have all of these videos of drones, and you can hear the sounds of different, of all these different war machines. There was never, in my opinion, under my observation, there was never a rocket that was fired from this compound. And so, but that was the pretext that allowed the hospital to become a target and to be rendered deformed. That person that you saw, who I told you was the chief of surgery when we were resuscitating that patient, among the more than 30 healthcare workers that when the military raided was abducted and detained, and is detained to this moment. This was in, this picture is from the first week of February. And so, the other implication of doing these sort of sieges on hospitals and raiding of hospitals is you put healthcare workers at a serious risk. In Gaza, there are more than 750 who've been killed and more than 300 who have been detained. If you're a physician or a nurse or a healthcare worker in Gaza right now, why would you show up to work if that's the risk? Why would you go to work every day knowing that at any given moment, this could happen, and then that could happen, and then that could happen? And it's a reality, and it's from north to south. There were no safe places in Gaza, and there is still no safe place in Gaza where this is being avoided. Right now, Kamal Adwan Hospital in the north, which is one of the main pediatric hospitals, for pediatric specialists, this is what's happening to them right now. Right now. So, it's become this sort of pattern that we have, we've had a tough time fighting back. This is the night of this post by NSF. We started hearing this. Do you hear that? Do you hear that noise? Mm-hmm. So this is the noise of tanks starting to roll and surround the hospital, and you can actually hear how the sound of the tank shuts. I'll play it one more time. So on the 23rd, when the evacuation order is in play, and you hear the tanks starting to surround the hospital, and you hear the shelling, all of the people that you saw in the courtyard in the middle of the night at around 2 or 3 a.m. grabbed whatever they could and started walking south in the middle of the night, which is incredibly dangerous. And many of the people that I was working alongside, the nurses and the doctors who were sheltering or sleeping in the hospital, grabbed their families and started heading south as well. Everybody knew that Anas's fate was sealed at that moment, and that there was nothing that was going to stop what was going to happen.
So basically, he didn't really tell us when to stop.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. So how do you guys end up, staying to finish up some of the things that?
The next day, most people were evacuated out. The remaining people, the medical staff, left the hospital. We were picked up by our organization, and they took us to another hospital. And there were a few people who decided to stay, and that's why you saw that picture there. Those people did not want to leave. They didn't want to leave their patients. All of them were Palestinians. And you were either arrested or you were killed in the process. And this is what happened to the hospital. So that hospital, we saw all of those tents. I mean, this is sort of, it became this wasteland. This picture down here is a picture of the dialysis center that was destroyed. We had 1,000 patients who were getting dialysis in Gaza, and this could accommodate 250 of them. In fact, it was taking care of 400 of them during the war. And so dialysis, typically you have kidney failure, you need to get dialysis about 3 times a week, 4 hours at a time on the dialysis machine. Because there were 400 patients in this area, we had to reduce that to 2 times a week, 2 hours at a time, to be able to accommodate all 400. And one of the days that I was there was a 16-year-old has a kidney failure from a congenital illness, and had a cardiac arrest and ultimately died as a result of not getting enough dialysis. The potassium in his blood continued to rise and rise and rise, and he wasn't getting the dialysis that he needed, and he suffered a cardiac arrest. And so this picture is taken from September. So the hospital has reopened, but only as a place that can receive patients, kind of like an urgent care. And they have 1 operating room when they used to have 6 operating rooms. And so, there is an effort by NGOs and the local healthcare workers to get this functioning again and open. But, in October, it's nearly impossible to kind of get it back to functioning. Yeah, you guys both that.
Were they detaining U.S. and Western affiliated physicians?
Yeah, no. To this point, I think since October until now, there's been no international healthcare workers who are volunteering who've been arrested or who've been killed. Yeah, so it's definitely Palestinians who are most at risk.
So I know you were just talking about the fate of the hospital after the IDF occupied it. Did they knock it all down? Is it still standing?
Yeah, so some of the structures are still standing. You can see here that there's some damage. It's clear that it was set. Some of these units were set. Fire was set to them. Was totally destroyed. At Nasser Hospital, one of the issues was sewage water destroyed the first floor.
Yeah.
So that's something that a lot of people were working on. And additionally, a lot of the area that you see, especially here, and that portion of it, is where it was the site of a mass grave from sort of the people who had remained, whether they were patients or people who were displaced or any of the healthcare physicians. So they found 200 bodies in that area there of folks. But yeah, there's still some of the structures were still intact. This was an outpatient unit, totally destroyed, as you can tell, so you can't use that. So it's about really just trying to find areas that you can still salvage.
Yeah, and the IDF obviously did not, for lack of a better word, bother to restaff any of these, didn't bother to provide medical aid to anyone in the area.
No, and that's never been the case. You know, from the perspective of the Israeli military, they will not sort of, they are not going to participate in any of the humanitarian relief at this point. And again, it's under the premise of that post that you saw, right? So that's that perspective. So it's the responsibility of the international community and the local Palestinians to sort of procure, distribute, and figure out the humanitarian aid aspect of it. And as you can imagine, that becomes increasingly difficult. I just want to take 2 minutes to just sort of update what the situation is like right now. I told you that on May 6th, the Rafah border was stormed, seized, and shut down. So we were used to be able to enter into Gaza as emergency medical teams under the World Health Organization through that entry, and you can go in Tuesday and Thursday were the days of the week that you can go. In fact, for example, the UNRWA head, James Elder, would be able to go in on Tuesday, be able to visit some of the sites that he needed to visit, and leave Thursday. Since the border was stormed, for 1 month, nobody was able to enter and exit. In fact, there was an emergency medical team that was there in Gaza, in Rafah, at European Gaza Hospital while the border was stormed, and they were sort of stuck in no man's land, waiting to figure out a new route. Among them was somebody who I'll be seeing tomorrow, Dr. Adam Hamawi, who is a plastic surgeon, an Army vet. He was a combat medic. He was somebody actually who was in during the Gulf War, during the Iraq War. The senator from my state in Illinois, Tammy Duckworth, her helicopter was struck and she was injured and she lost both of her legs. He saved her life. He was stuck in Gaza at the time with no recourse for being able to get out. And it took them about a couple of weeks to finally find an alternative route. And the alternative route now is people are going to have to go to Jordan instead of Egypt. From Jordan, they cross into Israel, and then through Israel, they'll go to Gaza. The problem is everybody for 6 or 7 months, or 8 months actually, had set up all of their operations out of Egypt. So everybody, Doctors Without Borders, World Central Kitchen, ANERA, ICRC, every organization that you've ever heard of had their operations headquarters for Gaza in Egypt. Suddenly they have to pick up and go to Jordan, which is a new bureaucracy you have to deal with, new permissions, everything from A to Z, all logistics had to be taken care of. You had to move it to Jordan. On top of that, all of the trucks that you saw in Egypt are still there and will never enter Gaza now because they've been there for several months. And so all of the humanitarian aid and the medical equipment and supplies will never get into Gaza because that border has been stormed. And at this point, more than 400 days later, what use is it anyway? Now you have to go through Jordan, again, new customs you have to figure out. And you have to go through Israel. And the new restrictions are, instead of having these days, Tuesday and Thursday, where the border is open and people can cross, you can only enter on Mondays, and it has to be for 4 weeks. There is no exception. Before, you could go for 2 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. And so, as you can imagine, for surgical subspecialists who are in desperate need, like orthopedic surgeons or trauma surgeons or burn surgeons, it's pretty hard to get international volunteers to be able to get 4 weeks. off. Really, it's 5 weeks with going back and forth and landing. I carried in with me, along with 4 of my colleagues through Med Global, we carried 30 bags of medical supplies with us. Insulin, we had these even tiny little coolers that we brought with us, chest tubes, anything you can imagine, we carried with us through the Rafah border. Now you can only bring 1 bag with you, and it has to be personal items. You can only bring in medication that is prescription medication and has your name on it. Before I brought in this diabetes medicine, there's a giant tub of it, over 2,000 pills of it. And if you are a Palestinian American, like I am, you are no longer allowed to enter into Gaza. These restrictions have been put in place since June and has made the response miserable. Primarily because we can't, address things on the ground as acutely as we would like to, with, folks bringing in and coordinating with local healthcare workers and saying, okay, I'll bring in this stuff, I'll be there Tuesday, we'll use it in the meantime until the next person comes. Yeah.
How do they know if you're Palestinian American? Because I assume most Palestinian Americans don't have any documentation after their grandparents left them.
So there's 2 ways. Most Palestinian Americans who live in Gaza or the West Bank have been issued ID numbers by the Israeli military. So, I won't say if I have one, but most Palestinians who still live in East Jerusalem, West Bank or Gaza in Palestine, they'll have Palestinian ID numbers. If not, when you get to the border crossing between Jordan and Israel, the King Hussein crossing, you are asked 3 questions. First, where were you born? Second, where were your parents born? Third, where were your grandparents born? And so that is how Palestinians are being identified and not being allowed to enter. So, these restrictions, as you can imagine, have made the response on the ground miserable. In October was the lowest amount of trucks that we had enter into Gaza in 400 days. The lowest amount of trucks. When I was there was a massive telecommunications blackout, so while all of this was happening, it was very difficult to be able to get a hold of anybody. We had to use satellite phones, which are banned, so you have to smuggle satellite phones into Gaza. It's banned by the Egyptian authorities and the Israeli authorities. So really tough to organize an emergency response, really tough to make a difference on the ground, really tough to have an impact. And when you have a humanitarian situation deteriorating like it did with respect to water infrastructure, shelter, overcrowding, you get things like polio. So polio had been eradicated for 26 years in Gaza. Gaza has, in terms of childhood vaccination rate, one of the highest in all of the Middle East. And we saw when you deliberately attack the infrastructure of healthcare, this is how things can accelerate. And we're talking about in less than a year, you had an outbreak of polio. 2 cases were identified. Any public health professional or infectious disease expert will tell you, if you have 2 cases of polio, it means you have a lot more polio spreading around. And so it should be looked at as a canary in a coal mine that we had a polio outbreak. The other sorts of infectious diseases that are spreading, whether it's skin infections or diarrheal illnesses, all of these things that can generally be managed when you just have the appropriate infrastructure in place. These things are running wild and rampant, and we have a horrible surveillance mechanism in place of who's getting what's happening to them. And that should really scare you if you're a vulnerable patient or you're a part of a vulnerable population. Children under the age of 5, people with congenital illnesses, pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, or elderly, or people with non-communicable diseases like diabetes or heart failure. So the last thing I'll say is, you hear the death toll is 40,000, and that there are 100,000 people been injured. That is a wild underestimate. If you look at why the Lancet wrote the review that they wrote, saying that we think at the minimum there's probably 180,000 casualties in Gaza since, and that was in July that they published that. Or if you look at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, they're saying the numbers could reach 250,000. Why? Because these numbers are only including numbers of people who died directly from an airstrike, or from a tank shell, or from a quadcopter, or from whatever it is. You're not thinking about the people who are in tents, who are severely malnourished, they get an infection like COVID, like RSV, and they die as a result of that. That's because of the war, is what the Lancet and the London School and Johns Hopkins is saying. These are all people who would not have died under regular conditions in Gaza. They're only dying because of the siege, of the blockade, because of the conditions on the ground. And deconfliction has totally failed in Gaza. The most recent example of this, everybody heard about the World Central Kitchen convoy that was attacked. 3 separate missiles hit 3 marked cars that had all of their movements coordinated, killing all of the humanitarian aid workers inside. But 2 weeks ago, in this city, Oxfam sent 4 Palestinian water engineers to repair water infrastructure because the water is unfit for human consumption. And in the process, with deconfliction, with their Palestinian ID numbers shared with the Israeli military, with their names, with their marked cars, all 4 of them were hit by a missile and killed. Water engineers anywhere in the world are not a dime a dozen. But in Gaza, at this point, 400 days in, to have water engineers working on the ground, I mean, it's a luxury that is something that we can't afford to lose workers like that. But what sort of environment or atmosphere does it create for everybody else that's working in this? Can you ask more water engineers to go finish the job that those water engineers were doing? No, I mean, any organization will tell you, I can't put my staff at risk. So the water infrastructure doesn't get repaired. So it's a really tough situation to be in. The last thing, as I conclude this, really is about what we can do, what sort of role can we play. And it's really sort of an advocacy role. It's about saying that there's a humanitarian crisis in play, and the things that we need to be things like the borders need to be open for humanitarian aid, they need to be instituted and implemented, deconfliction needs to be upheld like it has been in other areas, and that there needs to be a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and now in Lebanon, as we see similar things happening. So, you know, I think that's an opportunity for us to play a role, especially when it comes to healthcare workers, people who are involved in public health. It's being able to highlight how this situation is not just one incident, but it's an incident that has a ripple effect on the local population, and is something that is so devastating, but can be managed. And there are people ready to manage it, and there are people ready to respond, just have to be given the opportunity. And so whether that's, you know, writing a letter, or talking to an elected official, or spreading awareness about things like this, or, you know, supporting organizations that are on the ground, I think all of that has an important role here, and I think our medical institutions can play an important role by sort of echoing or amplifying our voices when we're calling for things like this. So I'll wrap up there. Sorry, I know I went over, but I really appreciate you guys coming out. I'm obviously still here if you want to ask any questions. I'm still available, but I know many of you have to get out of here because you have obligations at work. Please feel free to do so. I'll be sticking around. Thank you.